Hello, everybody. This is Jennifer Matarese, and before I get started with the episode today, I just wanted to take care of the usual housekeeping. If you've been wanting to hear a particular disaster on the podcast, you can do so for a $25 or more donation to the podcast PayPal account at disasterarea@mail.com or the podcast Venmo at Disaster Area Podcast. Just add the name of the disaster you'd like me to cover to the notes on your donation, and I will add it to the list. Please bear with me. I am legitimately terrible about responding to messages, but rest assured that I will add your requests to my to-do pile. And if it's been a while since you sent in your request, feel free to shoot me an email or a message for me to just double check and make sure that I didn't let you slip through the cracks. I'd appreciate it myself. Now, normally when it comes to requests, I do them when and if I can, but this will mean I will definitely cover the topic you request as soon as I can finish all of the research for it and write it up. Please keep in mind that the bigger the disaster, the more sources I may need to whittle down. The less well-known a disaster is, the more I may need to search for sources, and the more recent or ongoing a disaster is, the more I may want to wait until it's over so that the complete story can be told and all loose ends can be tied up. The subject from this particular episode was requested by Alyssa, and I would like to thank them for their request and for the donation. Now, if you'd like to help support the podcast in another way, you can do so with a one-time donation through PayPal at disasterarea@mail.com or on a per-episode basis through Patreon at www.patreon.com/disasterareapodcast. A per-episode donation of even as little as $1 an episode can help me do things like pay the rent and keep the lights on and occupy my dog with whatever it is he's occupied with right now so that he's in an entirely different room and not snoring in the background. So if you do become a patron, I would very much appreciate it. And if you do join the Patreon, you will now get new episodes as soon as I record them, rather until waiting until they are released every Wednesday. Now, I have gotten a little backed up the last couple of weeks. I am getting this recorded right now at 12 o'clock midnight on Wednesday, but I should be able to start doing what I was doing beforehand and recording them a little earlier so that the people who are Patreon supporters will be getting that little advantage of some extra time with the episode before everybody else gets it. You can also follow the podcast on Facebook at Disaster Area Podcast and on Twitter and Instagram at Disaster Area Pod. And please think about rating and reviewing the podcast on iTunes, Apple Podcast, wherever it is that you might listen to us on. But if you rate and review on Apple Podcasts, it kind of jumps us up the charts and gets more people to look at the podcast. When I say us, of course, I mean me. So if you would do that, I would really appreciate it. And as always, the sources for each new episode can be found at disasterareapodcast.wordpress.com. With all of that taken care of, thank you very much for listening, and welcome to Disaster Area. Episode 168, The Prestonsburg Bus Crash, February 28th, 1958. 27 deceased, several injured. One of the side effects of having a disaster podcast is that I occasionally run out of disaster documentaries to watch. I've seen every episode of Air Crash Investigation, Seconds from Disaster, Disaster of the Century, and 0 Hour. I have seen every 9/11 documentary on YouTube that isn't a festering, bigoted pile of conspiracy theories held together with spit and a prayer. I have even specifically ordered a DVD of a documentary made by a filmmaker local to the area that I used for this podcast episode because I couldn't find it to stream anywhere online, even though I really don't buy DVDs much anymore. So sometimes I just end up watching the same old documentaries I've already seen half a dozen times or more. Last week I rewatched Impact, a documentary available through Amazon Prime about the Carrollton bus crash covered all the way back in episode 27. 27 people, mostly teenagers, died on a school bus in Kentucky after an accident in which the initial crash wasn't what killed them. Oddly enough, that sentence doesn't just describe the Carrollton bus crash. 3 decades earlier, Kentucky suffered an eerily similar tragedy with one big difference. It wasn't fire which took so many children from the families of one small town. It was its exact opposite. Now, depending where you are in the world, school buses may be perfectly normal sights on the roads. Buses meant for the sole purpose of transporting children safely to and from school. Whether they're taking you to a team game, an academic event, a class trip, or just back home at the end of the day, we've almost all been on a school bus at some time or another in our lives. But there have been very significant bus tragedies dating all the way back to the first horse-drawn school bus in the early 1800s. So let's look at a few. One of the most significant school bus disasters would occur in March of 1931. On March 26th, it seemed like it would be a beautiful spring day in the area of Towner in eastern Colorado. Snow was predicted for later that day, but it sounded like a silly notion. It was warm, it was lovely out, and it was so nice some of the kids getting ready for school that day decided to leave their coats at home. But the clouds kept building over the next few short hours, and it was looking to be one of those terrible windy storms where you needed to tie a rope from one building to another to get from your home to the barn. Now, you have to keep in mind, this is like the middle of nowhere. It is farms everywhere. It is a lot of kids who are getting up bright and early to help out. And so you have a lot of farmhouses and big open spaces. And the good thing about that, though, is that everybody helps everybody else. So if you get into some sort of accident or you need some sort of assistance and you're nearby some farmhouse in the area, you can just go up, knock on the door, say, look, I need a place to stay. I need, somewhere to dry off. It's very cold outside. I got stuck in the snow, that sort of thing. And you can do that in this particular area. The clouds kept building over, I already did that sentence. The school that all of these kids had gone to that day didn't have the proper necessities to keep the building warm, and the kids fed if they got snowed in. They had no wood to burn in a stove. They had no extra clothes. They had no food, nothing like that. The kids brought their own lunches, that sort of thing. So if they were stranded there for the whole day, then the kids only had whatever they brought with them that day. So the two teachers at the school there consulted with the bus drivers, and it was decided that the kids should head out and go home, and if not get to their own homes, at least reach the nearest farmhouse and ride out the storm there. Half of the kids would climb into a school heading west, and the others into one going east. Now, the one going to the west was fortunate enough to make it to a local farmhouse, where they were able to be taken in for the duration of the storm. Like I said, it was that kind of an area. They showed up at the farmhouse, and the family just took them in, kept them warm, let them stay overnight, gave them food, everything. The other 20 kids piled into the back of farmer Carl Miller's blue 1929 Chevy truck, which he'd turned into a school bus for the winter months to head to the east. It was about the size of a minivan, so the kids were packed in pretty tight. Miller planned to head to the Untite farm, the Untite family's farm, but almost as soon as the bus departed at 9 that morning, Miller almost immediately lost his way. The wind was blowing so much, and it wasn't like there was a lot of snow. It was just that the wind was howling, and in that area of Colorado, the wind is absolutely terrible, especially at a time like this, and so it went from pretty bad when they were planning on leaving to within 15 minutes of him driving away from the school, he just could not see 2 feet in front of the bus. It was just impossible. The furious wind spun the snow so wildly that Miller couldn't see past his truck's radiator. The rear windows were covered in ice, and he tried to get the kids to peer outside as he drove across what he thought may have been a field. He was willing to drive across the field to get to whatever the nearest home was. He was trying to get to the Untite farm, but this bus that he had, some of the windows were broken. Only a piece of cardboard separated the kids from the freezing cold outside with those windows. It wasn't exactly the best situation to be in. So he really needed to get these kids to a safe place to stay for the rest of the night. Now, the kids were in a pretty good mood, even when the bus got stuck in a ditch. With the howling wind making it feel like it was a good 30 degrees below zero outside of the unheated bus, Carl Miller knew they were already in a little bit of trouble. The kids were still having this grand old time. They thought it was a great adventure. They weren't in school anymore. And so they were, having a pretty, they didn't think anything was going wrong. But soon enough, the snow drifted in through the broken windows, and the kids' lunches froze to the floor. They had those steel lunch boxes, and so they were down on the floor, and it didn't take long for them to freeze like that. Carl Miller tried to start a fire in a bucket that he had, but the matches that he had were wet, and so he couldn't start the fire. Carl Miller tried to keep the kids moving to prevent them from experiencing hypothermia. They were starting to slow down a little bit. It was kind of getting clear the cold was getting to them. But as the hours passed and it turned into March 27th, Miller knew that he had to go get help. They stayed there overnight, and it was pretty clear that these kids were starting to be really affected by the cold. He took the older kids, who were about 15, 14 or so, and he told them to watch over the little ones. And then he just, closed his jacket, put on his hat, gloves, all the stuff that he had, and walked out into the blinding snow. Not long after he left, the first child passed away from the snow. The cold. 2 more would be dead by the time several of the fathers of the kids, searching for the lost school bus, located it in a ditch on Hollytowner Road. They quickly rushed the children to a nearby farmhouse to warm up, but 2 more kids would pass away that night as well. Later on, Carl Miller would be found dead around 3.5 miles away from the bus. He'd been using a barbed wire fence as a guide for his hands, much like I described before with people tying a rope between their house and the barn. So if you wanted to get back from one building to the next, you would grab on and just kind of follow it, even if you couldn't see, 2 feet in front of your face because of the snow and the wind. And so when they found his body, his palms were just all bloody and torn up from grabbing onto this barbed wire to try and go get help. He was really trying, but it just, under the circumstances, it wasn't going to work. While the Pleasant Hill bus tragedy, as it came to be known, was an awful nightmare, it led to several changes we still see today in American school buses. Buses needed to have 2-way radios on board, and the tragedy was actually part of the reason school bus manufacturing standards set 8 years later would include all school buses being painted that now familiar, highly visible shade of yellow. There were also other things, like they made a rule that schools had to have a telephone installed, which at the time was not common. A lot of places didn't have phones. It was a little bit of a luxury, especially considering we're just about to enter the Great Depression. But anyway, before those particular school bus manufacturing standards were set, another horrific school bus disaster would take place in Sandy, Utah. On December 1st, 1938, 29-year-old Farrell Silcox pulled out of his driveway a little bit earlier than usual in a 1935 GMC, would have been General Motors truck, General Motors something. I am not a truck person or a vehicle person for that matter. But it was a GMC Superior bus to pick up the kids along his bus route to Jordan High School. It was snowing, hence why Silcox was early, so a few kids actually missed the bus that day. This is another area where there were a lot of farms and kids who had to get up early to help milk cows and collect eggs and things like that. So they were up. It was just a matter of the fact that they didn't expect the bus to come at that time, and so when they were, they're in the middle of milking the cows, they're carrying buckets out of the barn, and there goes the bus. School bus drives right past them. So, a few of these kids did miss the bus that day. But 38 students reached the bus just in time, despite Silcox being a good hour ahead of schedule. The bus didn't have a heater, and the ride to school would take about 45 minutes. This left the kids wrapped up tight and warm in as many layers as possible, trying to be patient until they reached the warmth of the high school. They were also keeping their voices down and any goofing around to a minimum. Mr. Silcox wasn't one to tolerate loud, unruly kids. No talking loud, no horseplay, nothing like that. He was one of those very strict bus drivers that you get who doesn't take any guff whatsoever. Now, the road the bus followed ran alongside the Denver and Rio Grande train tracks, and the bus would keep on that route until it reached Bergen's Crossing, and turned right to cross over to the other side. Basically, it made a 90-degree turn, crossed the train tracks, made another 90-degree turn to the left, and continued onward on that side of the tracks. The windshield didn't fog over, even though the windows throughout the rest of the bus had kind of fogged over. The windshield was set up so that it wouldn't fog over. There was kind of a rudimentary anti-fog system set up there. And so, if Silcox was going over these tracks and needed to look to the side, he could always open the doors to the bus and look out and see what was going on to the right. And if he wanted to see what was going on to the left, the driver's side window next to his seat, he would have been able to see out of that as well, because that also had sort of that rudimentary, anti-fog system going on there. What Silcox couldn't know was that his early start coincided with the late arrival of Denver and Rio Grande Freight Train 31, which was also affected by the snow. It wasn't quite as heavy by the time train number 31 approached Bergen's Crossing, but that wasn't the problem at that precise moment. It was the fact that, given where they were situated in the locomotive, Train 31's engineer and fireman had an absolutely terrible view of the tracks ahead of them. There's a reason engineers in these sorts of locomotives would lean so far out of the locomotive if they needed to see an obstruction up ahead. These locomotives, you see pictures of them and it's like, wow, they look pretty big. And then you see them in person. These particular locomotives were huge. They were enormous. And so to be able to see over them, past them, around them from when you were inside them was incredibly difficult. And so part of the fireman's job, and the fireman was there to kind of shovel coal into the engine for the locomotive to keep it going. Part of his job was also to be able to peer out of the other side of the train, where he had a better view, not much better, but a better view of what was up ahead than the engineer did, and to tell him, if he had to stop or anything like that. The engineer of train 31 would have needed half a mile's worth of warning to slow down to avoid hitting Farrell Silcox's school bus if it crossed the train tracks at that moment. But his fireman, who was meant to watch for hazards ahead since his view was somewhat better, only spotted the bus a few hundred yards before they reached Bergen's Crossing. At that moment, the bus was still a couple dozen feet away from the tracks. It was like 25 feet back from the tracks. So at that point, the fireman was kind of expecting that, he would stop there. He was stopped at that particular point, and he wasn't pulling the bus ahead. So it was kind of assumed that that was where he was going to stay at that point. Why Farrell Silcox did what he did next is unknown, but instead of staying put, he pulled the bus forward, took out the throttle, whatever it is you need to do to get the bus to go forward, and moved over onto the tracks. As he did, a kid at the front of the bus and the fireman on board Train 31 realized at the same time what was going to happen. The fireman told the train's engineer to pull the emergency brake immediately. The kid screamed, "Train!" A split second later, Train 31 tore through Farrell Silcox's school bus, ripping the bus open and spilling kids and their belongings all over the tracks. In photos from the site, what was left afterward looked like the bus had been badly peeled, like someone trying to get at a banana using only a pair of forks. It kind of wrapped around the cow catcher at the front of the locomotive at the front, and then it just sort of pulled the top off of the school bus. If you've ever had like a matchbox car, and it's become a little bit loose and it becomes detached from the bottom, that's sort of what happened here, where the bus sort of was pulled apart by the train. The train was a good 2 or 3 stories above what the bus was. So, this is a huge locomotive right here. And it ripped that bus to shreds. the bus itself was not situated the way that a bus today is situated. Instead of having those 2 rows of seats that go up both sides of the bus like you would see in a plane, it was 1 row of double seats, like normal, in the middle of the bus. And then on either side, you had benches that people, the students, could sit on. And that's how they would be able to fit 54 people into these buses. So when you look at the pictures of the bus as it's torn apart, you can actually see the benches that were against the side of the bus, next to parts of the bottom of the bus where single double seats are sitting as well. So it's just really upsetting to see. It's just the fact that there were kids in that bus when it was struck is you start to think about how they must have turned out when it was struck, and it's not pretty. Of the 39 people aboard the bus that day, 25 students and Farrell Silcox would die as a result of the crash. Nearly all of them died instantly, with 2 students dying later that day of devastating injuries. So the one blessing here is that nearly all of the people who died like in a heartbeat. They were struck and they were dead. That was it. And as horrible as the crash was, they didn't suffer. No one made it out of the crash without serious injuries for understandable reasons. The Sandy, Utah bus disaster would be perhaps the deadliest bus accident in American history at the time, but just for the next 2 decades. It's really hard to find a list of, bus disasters that are solely focused on, school buses and how deadly they were and when they happened and what all this stuff. So it's, a little hard to kind of separate them from regular bus disasters, because there are others as well, one of which I'm going to probably do next week just because I'm in a bus mood. But in this particular instance, the Sandy, Utah bus disaster was incredibly just an awful tragedy. And then came our next story, the focus of the episode. Now, February 28th, 1958 was an understandably gray and chilly day in Floyd County, Kentucky, located in the center of the eastern part of the state. Fortunately, at least, it wasn't snowing, and the roads in the area were cleared and free of ice. Bright and early at 7 a.m., 27-year-old John Alex DeRosset climbed into the school bus he drove on the regular to transport students to and from the local schools in Prestonsburg, the county seat of Floyd County. His route started in Cow Creek and passed through the villages of Sugarloaf and Emma as well. Some of the buses John DeRosset drove for the district weren't exactly in the best condition. The day before, he'd been driving a school bus where the rear emergency door had been tied shut with wires rather than being sent out to be fixed. But on February 28th, he would be driving bus number 27, a vehicle which had recently been checked over in the shop. So if there was anything wrong with the bus at that particular time, someone should have noticed. DeRosset continued through his route without much fuss for the first hour or so. The kids who boarded the bus that day were dressed like you'd expect for winter in the late 1950s. You've got sweaters for everyone, long skirts on the girls, loafers, and saddle shoes. You've got the bobby socks on, barrettes, horn-rimmed glasses, sort of these high and tight haircuts on the boys. Usually, as seems to be tradition at most schools, the seats in the back of the bus were the kingdom of the older boys, where they would goof around as far from the watchful eyes of the driver as possible. The rest of the seats were kind of a free-for-all. At 8:10 a.m., bus number 27 pulled up to the stop at the mouth of Notley Hollow, about 3 miles to the east of Prestonsburg, where a cluster of 8 kids stood around chatting in the chilly morning air. I don't know exactly how to explain a hollow to people who don't live in America. I really don't understand it myself, I guess, but it's basically, it's sort of something that you're only going to see in places like West Virginia and Tennessee, maybe Kentucky, where it's you sort of it's a certain area where it's a hollow. It's you get a mental image when you hear the hollow, and that's kind of what you're talking about. Two of the kids at the stop that morning were Joyce and Rita Matney, 14 and 8 years old, respectively. As the kids were boarding the bus, someone among the crowd posed a question to Joyce. "Hey, Joyce," they asked, "what's your grandpa's pickup truck doing down there by the ditch line?" What coal miner Banner Burkett's abandoned pickup was doing, apparently, was being hopelessly stuck in the ditch about 600 feet or so down US 23 around the curve from Notley Hollow. Burkett lost control when driving to work that morning, so he left the truck there to be pulled out later. I said Burkett. I think it is Burchett. Donald Horn, better known as Dutney, operated a 1953 Ford Wrecker, and that morning he was in the process of getting the Wrecker into the correct position to hook it up to the trapped pickup and haul it free from the ditch. Another local man, Joe Crum, stopped to help Dutney Horn with the truck as well. I know his name is Donald, but I do keep calling him Dutney Horn in this script because I really can't help it. It's just such a great name. The thing is, it wasn't hard to see Dutney Horn's Wrecker. It was so visible to those in the bus as they turned the curve to get to that particular point that at least one of the boys in the back of the bus made a bit of a joke about it. He said something along the lines of, "How much you want to wager Mr. DeRosset hits that Wrecker?" It was clear as day out there. It was really hard to miss. It might be in the way of the bus, but there was no reason whatsoever Mr. DeRosset shouldn't be able to stop or swerve around it or whatever. He was only going about 40 miles per hour. Not that slow, not that terribly fast either. And he seemed comfortable enough at the time. He was talking with some kids nearby, at least two of whom were hanging out in the stairwell down to the front of the bus. You know, they're all boys, of course, because this is something that boys would do. Teenage boys would be hanging out in that well of the stairwell at the front of the bus. Then Mr. DeRosset let out a yell. Some of the 48 students on that bus at that moment only heard him hollering. They were too far back in the bus to see what was going on exactly. But 17-year-old Isaac Vanderpool was sitting just behind Mr. DeRosset, and he saw it plain as day when the bus hit the rear bumper and fender of the left side of Dutney Horn's Wrecker. The Wrecker skidded ahead a good 60 feet or so. Meanwhile, the bus almost immediately jerked hard to the left, eliciting a cacophony of screams out of the kids on the bus. Bus 27 bumped against a parked car, then bounced past and rolled over the dry brown grass outside Benny Blackburn's trailer. Now, everybody knew Benny. This is a small area. Everybody knows everybody else. Even if you are, it's not a very populated place. Everybody knows everybody else, and everybody knew Benny. He was a bootlegger in what would still be a dry county for the next couple of decades. If you're not from America, again, if you don't know what a dry county is, it is a county where you cannot buy liquor. So you cannot go to, there's no bars, there's no, or at least no bars that serve alcohol. You can't go to the store and buy, a 6-pack or anything like that. If you want to buy booze, you have to go to the next county over. And counties like this tended to have, they still exist actually in America. They usually exist in like the South or in, Utah, places where it's more conservative. And, the thing about having these dry counties was that there was always somebody, more than one somebody probably in the county who was making bootleg gin or moonshine or whatever people wanted. And there might have been some cruel people who weren't particularly happy about the fact that he was a bootlegger, who would have been happy enough if the trailer that he owned stopped the bus just as long as everyone involved wasn't hurt. You know how it is in small towns. There are a lot of very nice people, but there are a lot of people who are not very nice at all, and some of them might not have had the best opinion of Benny Blackburn. That probably wouldn't have lasted very long after what happened next. Careening past the trailer without hitting it, Bus 27 then rolled over the steep bank and directly down 83 feet of embankment into the Lavisa Fork of the Big Sandy River. Keep in mind, the bus hit the wrecker. It immediately turns left, and it can't seem to turn away. to turn to the right and just kind of swerve around the truck, the wrecker. It goes past Benny Blackburn's trailer, which if you see images of that area today, it's really hard to imagine how he even managed to put a trailer there. It's a very narrow spot. And at that particular point, the bus gets to that top of the embankment, and it's slow how it gets to the top of the embankment and then tips over and goes down the embankment and rolls towards the water. And once it gets towards the water, the ground there kind of flattens out a little bit, so it slows down even then, but it still goes into the water. The whole thing took about a minute, which in disaster time, it's basically like an hour. I mentioned the Carrollton bus crash at the beginning of the episode, and in that particular instance, the bus was struck by a drunk driver in a pickup truck going the wrong way on the highway. It was nighttime, and when they tested later on, they found that the driver of the bus, John Pierman, would not have been able to stop in time if he had seen the bus, the pickup truck coming toward him, because it just happened like that. It was maybe like a couple of seconds, if that. There was nothing to it. In this particular instance, it just kept going, but it was going so slowly. And, it slowed down before it went over the hill. It slowed down before it rolled into the water. Like, there were a couple of points in this progress that something could have stopped this entire thing from happening. Now, normally a thick strip of trees would have stopped the bus hard as well. This is a very thickly treed area, I guess you could say. Especially now, it's very lush there, and at the time, there would have been a bunch of trees right there. But that day in February of 1958, the Big Sandy River's banks were higher than normal, rising above the flood stage and flowing up over the tops of the trees, which would have stopped the bus under normal circumstances. See, there were a line of trees at the top, which wasn't too thick. Lower down, they were thicker, and it would have been right where right before it stopped into the water. But of course, at that particular point, the water was really high between, there'd been some heavy rains lately, and also there was melt from the winter snows. So the water was swelling very high in the Big Sandy River. Once in the water, the bus floated for a handful of minutes, barely long enough for the stunned children to work through just what happened and set to work escaping from the bus. At the front of the vehicle, John DeRosset sat slumped unconscious in the driver's seat. The bus's windshield broke sometime during the accident, maybe when it struck the water. It's never really clear in any of the accounts that you can see. And the kids who were in the bus at the time, who were interviewed later in their life when they were older, I mean, they were too focused on getting out. I don't think they were really thinking about when this windshield broke. Freezing cold, muddy brown river water flowed through into the bus. Now, keep in mind, the reason this river is called the Big Sandy is not because it's muddy. It's not muddy. I say muddy water, but the thing is that it is just very, very sandy, and it's part of the reason it got obviously it's the reason it's got its name, but as you'll see later, it's also something that's kind of, it impacted the rescue later on. Normally, the river would be about 10 feet deep, but between the melting snow and the recent heavy rain, the Big Sandy River at that point was at about 20 to 30 feet above flood stage. It really depends on what source you look at. I believe the National Guard report on the incident said 20 feet, or it might have said 30 feet. I know that other accounts have said 20. There was an account from an interview that was in the documentary The Very Worst Thing, where somebody quoted it as 33 feet above flood stage. The important fact is that the water was far deeper than it normally would have been. With no other adults on the bus and Mr. DeRosset passed out in the driver's seat, it would be up to the kids to save themselves in the seconds and minutes which followed the bus first hitting the water. 13-year-old William Leedy blacked out for a moment when the collision first occurred, but now he got up out of his seat close to the rear emergency door and turned the handle. He and several other boys at the back of the bus pushed in vain at the door before William gave it a good kick and it finally swung open. Now, William Leedy he's a 13-year-old boy. He is shown in pictures in The Very Worst Thing, and people talk about him in interviews, and he was a kid. He was 13. There was nothing to him. He was this scrawny little kid, and he managed to kick open this door. I mean, obviously there were these other kids that were helping, but the fact that he kicked open the door and was able to get that open was very impressive, considering. By the time William Leedy opened the rear emergency door, bus 27 had already floated about, 10, 20, 30 feet away from the shore. It was already pretty far from the shore, enough so that you couldn't just get out of the back of the bus and maybe get your feet wet at most. You were gonna have to, get in that river and try to get to shore. Because they were the first ones at the rear of the bus, the first ones to get out and into the river were the teen boys who normally sat in the back. Several of them tumbled out, with William Leedy, who was a good swimmer, grabbing anyone who needed help and pulling them toward the riverbank. Some of the kids had the luck, if you want to call it that, of being the only kid in their family on the bus. As we've seen before, if someone you love, a sibling, a cousin, a girlfriend or boyfriend, a child, is with you when disaster strikes, it's hard to just go outside to safety and wait there if you get separated. You may be sensible enough to realize you can't save everyone, but there are certain people in this world you'd run into a burning building to rescue without question. I thought about the Pulse nightclub shooting, the Hartford circus fire. Those were some stories that really popped into my head from the start of that, where I specifically remembered stories of people who knew for a fact that somebody, or at least thought that their child or their partner or something like that was still inside. And so they decided, I'm going to go back in and I'm going to get them. And unfortunately, in doing so, they lost their lives. There were several sets of siblings inside the bus. Out of the boys in the back, there was a 14-year-old kid with bad acne and a serious expression in his school photo whose name was Bucky Ray Jarrell. He had a really easy way out of the bus. He could basically just turn around, walk, swim right out of the exit. But his 13-year-old sister Katie had been sitting nearer to the front. Bucky Ray didn't think twice, and he plunged forward to get her. In some accounts, he actually made it out of the boat and was the bus and was swimming toward the shore. And then he realized, Katie's still inside the bus. I have to go get her. And so he went back. Dootney Horn and Joe Crum scrambled down the hillside to the water to help pull out struggling children who were still in the water. So too did bootlegger Benny Blackburn, whose trailer only just escaped being struck by the out-of-control bus. Soon enough, others followed them down to the riverbank, grabbing for every coughing, soaking wet, shivering child who scrambled ashore or still struggled to reach it. Benny's wife Edna rushed the kids up to the trailer to warm them up and let them change if they needed to, while Benny dived in to rescue several of the kids from the strong current. All of the people who'd watched the bus crash and were now racing down to help save the kids would later say they never once saw the bus's brake lights flash. In the bus, some kids managed to wriggle their way out of the windows. 14-year-old David Wright managed to get out one window toward the front, then reached back in while hanging onto a tree and hauled a couple of little kids through as well. Meanwhile, the rushing water swept some kids right out the rear emergency door, saving them from being trapped inside the bus, but sweeping one or two away in the strong current in the Big Sandy River. Benny Blackburn would later say that he spotted a few kids who'd been caught by the current, who'd grabbed onto the nearby trees, but were still swept away regardless. There was also another kid, I believe it was William Leedy, who told of, he was on the shore, he was trying to help, and he saw a girl who was in the water. He went to reach to grab her. He actually grabbed her hair, and the current was so strong that she was pulled right out of his grasp, and all he was left with was this handful of hair. As the survivors who'd reached the shore watched, the bus began to sink into the river. Tiny hands and arms were still flailing through the open windows as kids tried to escape the sinking bus, even as the water level inside the bus must have been rising over their heads. Isaac Vanderpool, the boy who'd been at the front of the bus and seen it strike the wrecker, was still inside near the front when the bus sank. He dove underneath the water, swam through the interior of the bus, and somehow managed to navigate struggling kids and a moving vehicle surrounding him to reach the open emergency door. Once he was out, Isaac Vanderpool pushed his way through the water to make it closer to help. 27 people, 26 children, and their bus driver died on February 28, 1958, when their bus struck a tow truck and ran off the road right into the Big Sandy River. Of those families who lost children in the crash, 3 of them lost every single child they had. Several of them, I should say. I think it was more than 3. James and Virginia Goebel, who owned a local store, lost all 3 of their kids, sons James and John and daughter Anna Laura. Joyce Matney and her sister Rita didn't make it out either. Neither did Bucky Ray Jarrell or his sister Katie. Forrest Cisco managed to get off the bus, then went back to get his own sister Glenda May, just like Bucky Ray had. Neither of them survived. The search for the bus and the bodies of the children lost to the Big Sandy took what was already a devastating tragedy and dragged it out for weeks, and then for months. The bus, it turned out, had tumbled over and over in the strong current as it went under in a mockery of an alligator's death roll. The current carried it approximately 250 yards downstream. I've seen 250 feet, but 250 yards sounds more appropriate, from where it entered the Big Sandy, but rescuers wouldn't know that for a couple of days. Within hours of the crash, local construction companies were on the scene doing what they could to help out. One company, I believed, was owned by a man named Henry Rainier. He basically brought everything. He bought like bulldozers and diggers and all of these different equipment that was needed to do whatever was necessary to help rescue these kids. One thing they needed to do to get started was clear a road down to the riverside, and so they set to work on getting that done. That way, rescuers and volunteers could bring down their own boats and start searching the waters of the Big Sandy. The National Guard soon arrived as well, 500 of them, along with Army engineers and Navy divers. Searchers would get into their boats just above where the bus went into the river, then let themselves be carried along as they felt along the bottom of the river with poles, or used big unsharpened hooks on sticks, which looked a lot like shepherd's crooks, to try and catch up any child that might be in the water, or to try and locate the bus. I keep calling it the boat. It kind of is, but it's actually a bus. The National Guard also did a lot of other things as well at the site. It didn't take long for the space along the roads to be lined with cars of the families of the kids on the bus, of people who came to help, of people who just wanted a rubberneck. So alongside the river, you have hundreds of people standing for hours watching as National Guardsmen, police, firefighters, other rescue personnel, and volunteers clogged the river with boats, barges, and rafts, searching around in the water for the children who'd been riding in Bus 27. So you have these National Guardsmen, and they're doing things like trying to direct traffic and trying to get people to move cars and telling, trying to get them to move, whatever they could do to organize what was a very chaotic scene up to a point. People were being very calm, but at the same time, you have you have people from the media who are showing up, and you have people, news reporters, television reporters, people, these news people with cameras, and you have kids and their parents who are showing up who are trying to, hand things over to help out the, to bring like food for the volunteers and things like that. So the National Guardsmen are trying to organize that, and it's just a really chaotic scene. Like I said, though, up to a point. There were people lined up on either side of the wreck site for a mile on either side, just standing on the side of the road, looking down at the river, watching to see what happened. Meanwhile, as all this is happening, like I mentioned, media outlets from across the country arrived in the area to cover the bus crash. Newspaper reporters interviewed whoever was available and willing to speak. Sometimes you had survivors who were willing to do that, but also you have to understand that those survivors were really traumatized by what happened, and so a lot of them were just like, no, I don't want to do this. And TV networks shared the story of Bus 27 far and wide. Sharing Floyd County's tragedy allowed people from around the country to know what happened and send whatever monetary help they could. That first night, with the sun going down and the children's fate becoming depressingly clear, the rescue personnel asked the families of those children who still hadn't been found to gather around. They had to face an uncomfortable truth. It was getting late, and it had been nearly 12 hours since the crash occurred. Would the families agree to calling off the search until the next day? In what must have been a heart-wrenching decision, the families agreed. With that, the search was shut down at 7 p.m. to start again the rest of the next morning. Over the course of the day, locals had been bringing the rescuers sandwiches and drinks, warm clothes or a needed tool, whatever they might need or ask for. Basically, any of the volunteers later would say, like, the National Guard and the Army, the Navy divers, Coast Guard, whoever was there, would say anytime they were hungry or they wanted something, all of a sudden you had some family show up with like, well, here's lemonade, here's I made some potato salad, they're just bringing food left, right, and center to make sure that these people were fed and were taken care of while they were searching for these children. Many of the people who did bring these things could only think of what might have happened if it had been their child. Now, the ones whose children were on the boat gave their blessing to essentially give up. They'd get their children back, one hoped, but by then it had to be clear they wouldn't be getting them back alive. 53 hours after the bus sank into the Big Sandy River, Navy divers and those on the site to help out were able to finally locate the lost bus. Those who knew the river well knew where the current tended to take things, and they followed the current right to a spot where they could see the yellow roof of the bus through the water. There was also an account that I saw that said that they could see one of the bodies of the children who was still within the bus sticking out of one of the windows, which I'll get to in a moment. And so because they could see his body through the water, they were able to locate the bus and start the process of bringing it out. A pair of bulldozers from Rainier Construction were hitched to the wreck to pull it out of the water, which piqued the interest of the thousands who had arrived at the site to watch the rescue and recovery process. So they got an eyeful when the bulldozers pulled the busted and dented bus out of the water. The rear emergency door was still open, and draping from just inside of it was the body of a young girl. Hanging from one of the windows was 15-year-old James Ousley, who'd clearly been trying to get out, only for his hips to get stuck as he tried to escape through the window. James's two younger brothers, Dallas and Dennis, had been on the bus as well, but thankfully survived. That was the kid that they saw floating in the water, supposedly, that directed them to where the bus was. Thick sand coated the interior of the bus, which meant digging through the mess to count how many kids were still aboard. Only 15 bodies were still within the bus, which left 12 unaccounted for. One of the bodies still in the bus was Bucky Ray Jarrell. Katie was nowhere to be found. There is film in the documentary The Very Worst Thing of the bus being pulled out of the water. And obviously this is taken in 1958. It's not the best film in the world. It's not very clear. I think if it had been clear, it would have been a little more appalling. But for the people who were there, you couldn't see the other side of the bus, like the left side of the bus where the the other side of the bus from where the door is. So it was, if James Ousley had been hanging out of a window, it would have been on that side of the bus. There was also, of course, as I said, a little girl who was hanging out of the back of the rear emergency doors. They pulled it in. You can see the doors open, but you can't really see what is there. And so you have all these people who are lined up alongside the road, like looking down, watching what's happening. It's entirely possible they saw those bodies, but the rescuers and the volunteers and everybody who was around trying to help, they immediately surrounded this bus. So if they could see the kids who were in the bus, they probably didn't see it for very long. The bodies of the dead in the bus were removed and taken to the National Guard Armory, where they were laid out on cots and covered in sheets. Reverend Ira McMillan of Irene Cole Memorial Church offered to go identify the children of the families he knew if they would prefer not to see the children in that state. They would have to go from one body to the next to identify their kid. And, you know, it's bad enough to see your own child in the condition that they would be, after being in the water for 53 hours. Imagine seeing more than one kid just over and over and over again. Or think about somebody like the Goebbels who have to go and look at 3 different children who are in that condition. Of course, at that point, only one of their children had been found in the bus. So that was not a blessing. I would not call that a blessing at all. But it's difficult to identify dead children in an accident under the best of situations, and this isn't the best of situations. There is no best situation to go identify a child. Let's be honest. And so he offered to do that and go make sure that those children were identified without them having to look and see that and have that in their mind. The kids were coated in sand from the bottom of the Big Sandy, which, like I said, that's where it got its name. And the workers handling the bodies at the armory needed to wash the sand away before people could even come in to look at them. There's stories of them like kind of just hosing them down. It was really the only thing they could do to just get all the sand off of them. The recovery of those who weren't in the bus became a round-the-clock job for some people in Floyd County. The day after the bus came out of the river, 14-year-old Linda Darby's body turned up a mile downstream. The next day, Joyce Matney, Marcella Jervis, and Emma Jean Darby were all located as well. Joyce McPeak was found the day after that on March 5th. At this point, 20 of the lost were accounted for, leaving 7 still missing. Now, William Jarrell, the father of Bucky Ray and Katie, got himself a boat at one point, got in, and started heading down the Big Sandy River with the intention of finding his little girl. After all, Katie had to be somewhere along the river. He kept a sharp eye out as he rowed the boat down all the way to Catlettsburg along the Ohio River 3 days later, but at no point did he see Katie. The National Guard had brought in 4 floodlights at the start of the search, and for weeks they lit up the sky near Prestonsburg as guardsmen and others continued to look for the 7 missing children. They also secured nets underneath the West Prestonsburg Bridge, several miles down from where the bus went into the water, to catch any of the bodies should they make it that far. It wouldn't be until April 8th that the body of one of the missing children, Anna Laura Goebel, would be found near the bridge, unfortunately in part by her own father, James Goebel. The next day, the Big Sandy would give William Jarrell back his daughter Katie as well. And the day after that came Montaigne Jervis. That left 4 more kids unaccounted for. 6 days after Montaigne Jervis was recovered, Doris Burkett was found as well. Then on April 23rd, searchers located the body of 8-year-old James Meade Jr., tangled up in a pile of trash. A week later, James Goebel's body was found, like his younger sister Anna Laura, by his father. 69 days after rescuers recovered the bus from the bottom of the Big Sandy, 9-year-old Paulette Klein was the last victim of the bus crash pulled out of the Big Sandy, found just underneath the cliff bridge 3 miles downstream. What made the investigation into the crash difficult was the death of John DeRosset. DeRosset wasn't around to explain why he didn't stop or pull around Dutney Horn's wrecker According to Dewtney Horn, DeRosset had no reason not to swerve around him. It was a clear day, visibility was good, and the road was clear. Looking at photos of the site today, Horn has a point. While there isn't much room off to either side of the road, it's a little difficult to even imagine how Benny Blackburn crammed a trailer onto the riverside of the road at that point, as I mentioned earlier. There's plenty of room on the road. The bus would have been heading east with the wrecker and the pickup in DeRosset's lane, yes. And while it was fairly soon after the curve between Notley Hollow and Benny Blackburn's trailer, DeRosset could have slowed and maneuvered around the wrecker. It wasn't like right there. As long as he was paying attention, and clearly he was paying attention enough to spot it and try to get around it. There were rumors Dewtney Horn backed the wrecker up as the bus was approaching, but Horn denied that, and even if he were, it appears DeRosset still had room to stop. Instead, witnesses said it appeared that DeRosset was trying to steer around the wrecker, but misjudged the distance and caught the edge of the wrecker's bumper. That left questions regarding the possibility of DeRosset experiencing some sort of medical emergency. Almost from the beginning, people were whispering about, well, DeRosset had like a heart condition and he was sickly and all of this. And it seemed like an effort to sort of steer blame in his direction. When the bulldozers hauled the bus of the river back out of the river, DeRosset's body was still slumped over in the driver's seat. An autopsy would show that DeRosset didn't experience a stroke or heart attack or anything else which might have impaired his ability to drive at that precise moment. In fact, he drowned while sitting unconscious in the driver's seat. So I'm not exactly sure when in this particular crash he was knocked unconscious. But apparently it wasn't because he had a heart attack or a stroke. It was just, probably at some point he banged his head off a steering wheel, banged his head off of something, and was out. But so what about the bus itself? Well, investigating problems there was difficult as well. When the bus sank beneath the waters of the Big Sandy, it rolled over and over, battering itself against the bottom of the river. Then, when it was pulled from the muddy river days later, the front wheels were yanked free during the retrieval. This made it hard, if not impossible, to answer questions about brake failure or steering issues. There might be a better option today. I'm not exactly sure. It might be a little easier for investigators to figure out exactly what happened in this case if it had happened today. But with what they were able to work with at that particular time, they really could not give a straight answer one way or another as to what caused the bus to roll over the embankment. Forensic engineer Roy Crawford proposed in the documentary The Very Worst Thing that when Bus 27 struck Dewtney Horn's wrecker, it may have knocked the front wheel off its mounts or jammed its own fender against the wheel, making John DeRosset unable to straighten out the bus once he went around the wrecker. But because of the damage done to the bus, there would have been no way to confirm one way or another what happened, or if that was a correct assessment. In the end, a court of inquiry would be held after John DeRosset's family requested one, allowing for several survivors and witnesses to testify as to what occurred. The court of inquiry resulted in the judge finding John DeRosset was innocent of negligence in the case of the Prestonsburg bus crash. It would be the only real investigation into who or what was to blame for the crash. No one else faced any charges, and no one sued anyone else either. What Floyd County did do, though, was support the hell out of each other. The school bus disaster committee formed in the wake of the tragedy raised an astonishing $55,000, over $500,000 in today's money. The money went toward covering funeral expenses and supporting the families of the deceased in the aftermath. Dewtney Horn received insurance money for the damage to his wrecker and immediately handed it right back over to the families. The school board paid out insurance money to the families of the dead children, all of whom got together and decided to give John DeRosset's family a share as well. But the kids themselves needed more than money. School shut down for a few weeks in the county, giving the kids time to grieve and work through their trauma. But that wasn't going to be nearly enough time for any of them, and at the time, therapy for post-traumatic stress after something like this was just not a thing that people did. Some of the kids struggled to board a bus again. One of the students who survived, and she ended up taking a cab for several weeks before she finally was able to get on a bus again. And at least one of the kids on the bus that day simply dropped out. I believe it was Winston Dillon was one of the survivors, and he just decided, you know what, I'm just not going back to school. I can't handle this. Only 2 months after the crash on April 27th, the Floyd County Emergency and Rescue Squad was created in response to the Prestonsburg bus crash. When the county realized there was a gap in what they'd been prepared for when the crash occurred, they resolved to fill that gap with a special unit designed to respond to just such an emergency. This was one of the concerns when the accident happened. You had, just this terrible accident, this terrible crash, and really a lot of the rescue personnel who were involved didn't have a plan for this. They really didn't know what to do. I'm not sure you make a plan for something like this, but they really realized that while they did their best, they also could have done better, and what they needed for that was a dedicated squad to